Hello, what's up dear YouTube viewers? In this video I would like to share with you on a novel, my opinion on a novel called The Gambler by Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. Now I haven't published a video in a long time because I was busy. But now I am back and I would like to share with you my opinion on that novel. In the intro to this channel, I promised you that I will be sharing my opinion on different books that I read sometimes. And I decided to start with Dostoevsky, because recently this writer has been gaining popularity among some people, and I decided to start with him. Now, I have only read two books by him. One book called White Nights, and The Gambler is my second book by him that I read just in February of this year. So I will not be able to compare this book with some of his other books such as Karamazov Brothers and Crime and Punishment. I absolutely have some of his other books on the list. For example, I wanna read a book called Writer's Diary, such I'm hoping to become a writer myself. I also have on the list a book by him called The Idiot, but for now I have only read two of his books. So I will not be able to compare The Gambler to some of his other books, but I will be able to share my opinion on that book. Now, if you don't want me to spoil this book to you, then don't watch the video. I will be spoiling that book because otherwise I will not be able to say what I think about. So basically, what happened in the book The Gambler is that a group of people were waiting for their old ancestor. For some people it was their grandmother, for some great-grandmother, to die and leave them huge money in will. But unfortunately for them, she ended up gambling her entire money in gambling casinos. So they ended up being left with nothing. Now, something I liked about that book was that I think it absolutely shows the relationship between relatives and the relationship between what can happen if you don't have a stable plan ahead of you. A lot of ways in that book, the people who were the clear bad guys, who were waiting for a person's death, got punished like they deserved, because they ended up being left with nothing. I think it's very wrong, of course, to purposefully wait for a person's death, even if you think they're gonna die soon anyway, and I think the people who were doing it were absolutely bad guys, and they got what they deserved. Now I know it might seem childish to want to see the bad guys get punished, and a lot of ways the bad guys, good guys narrative is more for children's books than for adult novels, but I still think that it was wrong to act as those people acted, and to not have a stable financial plan ahead of them, and to want their relatives' death. And I think the fact that they got punished is an absolutely justifiable end to that book. Another thing I like is that a lot of ways it shows what can happen if you gamble too much, and how at first the old woman just wanted to play a little, but then the moment she started winning, she gambled all of her money. So I think it shows how people get addicted to gambling, and it warns about how to be careful with gambling. Okay, now something that I didn't understand about that book is why the grandmother ended up losing all of her money. Because throughout that book she acted like a very wise person. She called out her relatives for warning her death openly and told them that they are not getting any money, and she seemed to be the person who was the wisest out of all of them and giving them good advice. And then all of a suddenly she just ended up losing everything. So she started out as a very wise person and ended up with what's seen as a really stupid action. Now, sure, her relatives did get punished, but at the end, I think if Dostoevsky wanted to show that bad people get punished, he could have done it in another way. For example, he could have said that she decides to give all her money to charity, or that she decides to, for example, build a house with her money, instead of just saying that she gambled everything. Sure, maybe Dostoevsky wanted to show that she was purposefully doing it because she knew that she would die soon and she would rather gamble everything than do anything else with it. But I still think that that's not how wise people usually act. And considering how wise she started at the beginning of the book, it seems strange that later she completely changed. Now, I'm not saying that Dostoevsky is a bad writer because of it. Who am I to judge the person who many people consider one of the greatest writers to ever exist? But I'm just saying that this is something that I personally didn't understand. Maybe some people would. Okay, now, who would I recommend to read that book for? The number one person who I would recommend reading that book for, the number one group of people, is people who want to understand what life was like for the Russian elite in that time. Because the old woman's relatives were part of the Russian elite. Even if not the most elite people, they were definitely on the wealthier end. And in a lot of ways, it shows how they lived at that time, how they wanted to go abroad, how they wanted to have money for luxuries and other stuff. So, if you want to understand what life was like for the Russian elite, I would definitely recommend this be a book you read. Also, I would recommend to read that book for people who want to understand more about gambling and how people get addicted to it. I think it shows that very beautifully. And the last group of people who I would maybe recommend to read that book to is people who want to understand the relationship between families more, get into the topic and what can happen in the family. Okay, now, who would I not recommend to read that book to? The biggest group who I would not recommend to read that book to is somebody who wants to read something in the Russian literature that's funny. Because no offense to Dostoevsky, but most of his novels are not funny. They are about life as it is, even the sad parts of it. So, if you want to read something funny, I don't think Dostoevsky is the writer who you should read. I think the book 12 Cheers by Ilf and Petrov is a little bit more funny, I also think that Chekhov could be the right fit if you pick the right book. Maybe Saltykov-Shchedrin could also be the right fit. Some people are saying his novels are funny. I have only read one small story by him, so I can't really judge if he's funny or not. I definitely have more of him on my reading list. But no matter what, I would not recommend you to read this book if you want something funny from the Russian literature. Another group who I would not recommend to read that book to is people who are not interested in Russian history and not interested in gambling or the relationship between families. Because this book is a lot of ways heavy on Russian history, and I do think that you need to learn at least a little bit of Russian history, at least on a basic level, before you read that book. To understand what was the role of the generals, the dvorians in the Russian society, and the krepostные. Fortunately, I was lucky enough because even though I live in the USA, I took a course on Russian history online before. It was a free course, so I have at least a basic understanding of Russian history. And you can always just look up with AI and ask who were dvoriане, who were krepostные, who were the other people in this. But if you are not interested in it and don't really wanna know, I would not recommend you read that book because I do think it requires at least a basic understanding of the Russian history. Another group who I would not recommend to read that book to is young people who want to understand maybe about finances but don't want to get too much into adult life because a lot of it is complicated and too much about adults. And young people, I'm not saying like 20 years old like me, of course. I am saying like more younger people, like 12 or 13 years old, who want maybe to understand something about finances but don't want to get into adult relationship too deeply. Now, overall, I would say this book was a good book, and I definitely don't regret reading it. It was something new for me. And overall, I would say I would recommend for people to read it. For most people, the only difference is that I think it has to be at the right age and at the right time. Overall, I would give this book a 5 minus. The only reason why I made it a bit lower is because, like I said before, not all of the terms are completely understandable in that book. So I couldn't give it a 5 plus. But I would still give it a 5 minus. So that people could understand what it's like. Okay, there you have it, guys. If you like this video, give it a thumb up. If you dislike it, give it a thumb down. Subscribe to my channel, leave comments. Hope you have a good day. Bye, guys.